Professor Gregorz Kolodko is a former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Poland and an outstanding economist. He planned the country's economic reform beginning in the 1990s. And in contrast to Russia, Poland's economy was able to survive and thrive because of what was called shock therapy. What were the reasons for that success? Professor Kolodko has recently said that neoliberalism is not dead yet, and it is brewing a bigger crisis in the US. What is what he calls neoliberalism 2.0? And what new circumstances will it bring to the world? Today, I'm honored to be joined by Professor Kolodko in our studio. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. In your recent work, you mentioned the concept of new liberalism 2.0, and you said this is a threat to the health and well-being of the world economy. What do you mean?
I'm sure that it's a threat not only to the country where it is coming from, namely the United States and to some extent Great Britain, but also to the world economy because of globalization and the international feedback we have between major economies like US in the West and China here and the remaining part of the world. And neoliberalism is not only a kind of ideology, it's also a certain economic theory and based upon it economic policy for growth and strategy for development, which is hardly delivering because through wrong deregulation, manipulating the fiscal system and too much of financialization, it is acting on the behalf of enriching the few at the cost of many. And that is causing a wrong reaction, which is in turn so-called new nationalism. And neither new or neoliberalism or new nationalism is a proper answer for the challenges we do have in the contemporary world economy.
On the other hand, the discourse on neoliberalism economy is considered to be the cause of the 2008 financial meltdown. But those who criticize neoliberalism also brought with them the rise of populism, protectionism, and in particular anti-globalization. So how do you assess the negative impact of neoliberalism? And in sharp contrast, do you think what we practice here, namely the state capitalism, quote unquote, by the Western media, is a counterweight. It serves as something to balance the theories of world economy.
Definitely, neoliberalism doesn't secure economic balance or equitable, sustainable growth, which has been proved first by American crisis and then by the world economic crisis. Yet some countries, first of all China, were not driven too much into this crisis because we did not have neoliberalism in China, we did not have neoliberalism in some other major emancipating economies like India. But one more time, you know, neoliberalism is advising wrong deregulation. Too far going deregulation is in favor of small government, because small government most of the time implies weak government, and then too much is being left to so-called invisible hand of the market. And the good recipe for the success is that a country, like a big country like, say, China, or medium like Poland, or small like what, Estonia or Slovenia or Costa Rica, is a proper synergy between invisible hand of market and visible hand of government-led policy. I don't know any better example of a success with this positive synergy than China, and this is not to say so because I'm now in China. This is just a fact. And therefore, neoliberalism, one more time, is not a proper answer for the challenges of the contemporary irreversible globalization. But it failed, and since it has failed and it cost due to too much of deregulation, wrong deregulation and financialization of the economy, the world economic crisis, we are looking for something alternative. And unfortunately, the alternative which have emerged in part of Western Europe, in some countries of Eastern Europe, to some extent also in the United States, yes, over there too. This is new nationalism. But, you know, enemy of my enemy doesn't make my friend. You know, you can give a wrong answer for previous wrong answer. So we are still looking for something alternative to both. On the one hand, to neoliberalism, and alternative to new nationalism. So if you would take a look into Europe, I think something like a positive response is coming from a policy of President of France, Macron. He is very much against traditional neoliberalism, and he is also not in favor of new nationalism, like, for instance, Mrs. Le Pen in France, or Mr. Orban in Hungary, or Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. And in the United States, you have maybe the worst of both, because you have the Trump administration, which to some extent is continuation of this neoliberalism, with this naive belief in the forces of the market, which is able to solve almost everything, but also with the touch of this new nationalism. So it's a very dangerous mixture, because what we have now, as far as the White House administration is concerned, especially President Donald Trump, is a mix of neoliberalism and populism. And definitely you cannot build the well-being
your
on this
critical review of the West would take us hours and hours. So let's come back to examine what China does. What do you think of the pivotal role of the central government? Because in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, most of the Central and Eastern European countries, along with Russia, went through a very stormy period of shock therapy. But your country survived. Your country managed to survive the shock wave. So China still relied on much of the planning. I would be very careful with the central planning, because central planning would bring us, we will be immediately awash with bitter memories about the war, Cold War and the Cultural Revolution. Today, China practices...
So first things first, you know, actually, I wasn't an architect of the shock therapy. I was a very principled critic of so-called shock therapy, because there were too much of shocks and not enough of therapy. And one of my books, which is also published in Chinese language, of course in English, is called From Shock to Therapy. And this policy, at the very beginning of the 90s in Poland, it rather failed. We lost 20% of GDP. There was 3 million of unemployed people, and high inflation and so on. So therefore we moved rather in gradual way, but with the strong commitment to meet the criteria of joining the European Union. And that is what we accomplished 14 years ago, when I was for the last time Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance. But unlike the Russians, I would say that since onset of the 90s, we in Poland and in several other East Central European countries, we did know where we were going. We were going to the European Union, so we had to meet the criteria of membership over there. And going back to China, China is going in a different way, but I don't know any other country with the ability of the leaders, intellectual and the political leaders and the business leaders of the country, to see the situation as a long shot, not just 2, 3 or 5 years, but rather 2, 3 or 5 decades. And for that reason, there is nobody, not any important country, who is able to manage this positive synergy of government policy with some central planning, with liberal market economy. So for that reason, China is a mixed system, which I call in my most recent book, I'm introducing new notion, Chinism. It's neither, you know, classical socialism, definitely it is not liberal capitalism. This is something different and better, because it does deliver relatively sustainable growth, but does not mean that you do not have problems. You have plenty of problems.
I'm afraid your American colleagues and friends would disagree with you about Chinism, or the uniqueness of Chinese economic planning. Look at the confrontation and the standoff between the two biggest economies. The Americans accuse China of subsidizing the high-tech research, for example, made in China 2025. That's the focus of the current debate. And do you think any failure of the trade negotiations between the two sides will seriously impact your country and indeed European economy and the European Union?
I'm very much concerned about the problems which have been created, which we have. I'm very much against any kind of trade war, and I rather admire the position of President Xi when he said at the World Economic Forum at Davos that globalization is irreversible, that we have to take care of free trade. We have to fight protectionism and to be in favor of inclusive globalization. Than for President Trump, who says that trade war is a nice thing and it is easy to win. He is damn wrong. In trade war, everybody is losing. The question is who is losing more, and there are not the winners. Especially from the American viewpoint, the deficit is a very serious challenge, but it is basically because the Americans are not competitive enough, and to impose protectionism as a solution to lack of competitiveness is not a good recipe.
Do you agree that China will suffer more economically, but President Trump will suffer more politically at home, since we target his power base in the agricultural segments of the society?
If you listened carefully what I said already a year and a half ago, when Trump was blackmailing, President Trump, that he will impose tariffs, duties, import duties, protectionist measures, and most of us, the economists, we didn't take it seriously at that time. I said that a smart policymaker is not declaring the war when he's doomed to fail. And definitely, the U.S. will be the loser, and if the war will escalate, which I hope is not going to be the case, definitely in the longer run, USA, American economy, will lose more than China, because China can go with export sector to other parts of the world and to exercise what you call in China win-win or inclusive globalization.
We have a big domestic market, by the way, and
you have the big domestic market, but
the economy.
But you do appreciate the other markets. You have launched the project Belt and Road Initiative, which is a lion's share of the world market.
But I'm afraid the European Union, for example, is very skeptical about what we want through the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, you can hardly hear such a...
Good point. Somebody is skeptical about your true aim, target, in so-called initiative, for instance, 16+1, which is a part of Belt and Road Initiative addressed to 16 Central Eastern European countries, and some bureaucrats or policymakers in Brussels, maybe in Paris, in Berlin, in Amsterdam, in Brussels, and so on, they may ask a question, actually, what China is looking here for. It is so far from your country, and this is the domain of the European Union. But I would say that, again, it is compatible. If you like to invest in upgrading of infrastructure in eastern part of the European Union, in countries like Hungary or Macedonia in the future, remember Poland or the Baltic states, I think it is compatible, not contradictory, to the investments which are being financed by structural funds from the European Union. So if I was in European headquarters, leaders' shoes, I would rather sit down together with China's experts and make a feasibility study. What we can do together for the sake of improvement, the infrastructure, and facilitating the growing trade between China and the European Union and other countries in Europe. This is the recipe. And take a look. European Union is not so much critical towards China as United States. And actually, take a look. President Trump policy of protectionism is also anti-European Union. So actually now we are closer, European Union and China, with our attitude to fight for free trade and inclusive globalization than the American administration. So American administration of the type which is now exercised by Mr. Trump is not there forever. I think it will be for another 2.5 years, and then we'll come back to the common sense, and we'll really work out the continuation of globalization, because it is a irreversible process.
Yes, indeed, the European Union and China decide to turn to the WTO for settlement of the disputes concerning particularly steel and aluminum. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Kolodko from Poland. He was a vice premier of the country and a very influential economist. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Well, it seems the rise of China has caused an earthquake one way or another. The issue is we have different political institutions, and many would argue we have different values. This helps create the schism, differences and disputes. Does it mean that we wouldn't be able to work together in partnership to bring about the co-prosperity?
Absolutely not. We may differ, yes, to some extent. We have different values in Asia and in Europe and in America, different in Western Europe and even in Eastern Europe still. There is not just anonymous unity, but these are not a conflict-like a situation. We differ, so we discuss, we respect each other. Nobody forces us to speak in Chinese or to eat with the chopsticks. You are eating your way, we are eating our way, but we respect each other. And I think that these emancipating economies, as I'm referring to them, in Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, East Central Europe, where I'm from, are very keen to get more engaged in cooperation, trade, investment, capital flow, exchange of human capital, technology with China. And if it has not been yet understood to the full extent by the American administration, they will learn. They will learn. When we are talking here, over 1,100 leading American economists, including 15 Nobel Prize winners, they signed a letter to President Trump with their concern that trade war and protectionism may lead to another great crisis, as they did 80 years ago prior to the crisis of 1929, 1933. So very many of our American colleagues, the economists, they think in a similar way as the leading Chinese and Polish economists, not as the White House administration. So we have to distinguish, because there is the fight within the leaders, intellectual leaders of the United States. Even the American delegation don't agree with each other. Your delegation, Chinese delegation, is homogeneous because you have the vision, not an illusion. You know your agenda, and you know what it is the negotiation about. And maybe you have to give a little bit up to the Americans and so on.
The boom of the Chinese economy over the past 4 decades since China decided to open itself up depended on the laissez-faire policy concerning more liberalization of the market forces. But still, public opinions are divided as to the role of the state-owned enterprises and the non-public sector. Now, let's go back to Poland. Poland, historians have pointed out, had 2 bad neighbors. One was Nazi Germany, the other the Soviet Empire. How could you manage to survive the shock therapy? You would be reluctant in describing the therapy you employed in the wake of the Cold War, but on your west you have the powerhouse of the European economy. To your east you had an economy that is basically closed due to the economic sanctions after Crimea. How could you survive? And,
it wasn't that
Is it a matter of a
difficult.
geo-economic issue or policy, or is it's a matter of survival?
One must remember that at the turning point in 1989, we were, to some extent, already liberalized, privatized, decentralized, deregulated. We were not as rigid, traditional, centrally planned state economy, like, for instance, in the Soviet Union or in Romania or in Bulgaria. So to move to market, to somehow liberal economy was much easier. Secondly, as I said already, there wasn't any successful shock therapy in Poland. There was rather shock failure, and only then there was a gradual therapy where we tried to introduce something what we refer to as social market economy. And I wouldn't say that it works 100%, because we have also political democracy, and public mood is going sometime left of the center, another time right of the center. Now we have the government which is rather right of the central, a little bit or maybe too much a populistic one, not enough pragmatic one, and so on and so on. This is, so-called liberal democracy which we have in the West, which sometimes helps economic management and sometimes make it much more difficult. Because when I'm arguing, discussing with you, it is enough to be correct, and to convince also our audience who is right and who is wrong. But if you go to politics in the country like Poland or wherever in so-called West, you also need majority. And pretty often the economic and political leaders, they knew how to settle the issues, how to solve the problems, but they were short of majority. So our legacy from the past is still lying in a long shadow. We have very bad, I may say, the worst ever relations with Russia, unfortunately. And that is not good for economic development also, because it is still our neighbor and so on. But we have very good relations now with Germany.
Poland was a major economy, major country in European history. Today, with the relaxation of border controls and particularly dynamics of globalization, do you ever have any dream that one day, in the foreseeable future, Poland would become yet another major power in continental Europe?
No, it's a nonsense. I know this
nonsense?
Another American author talking about Poland as the superpower on the Vistula River, which is our main river. It's a megalomaniac thesis. We are the powerhouse of the region. We are the most important economy in East Central Europe. We are one of the major players in the European Union. That's it. But our output is still less than 1% of the global output. Our population is, no more than 0.5% of the global population. So our fight for better future is to sustain the rate of growth above the average, to catch up with the richer part of European Union. And to this extent we are succeeding, because we started with GDP per capita, say 25 years ago, less than 50% of the average of the European Union, and already it is more than 70%, and our Prime Minister is even believing that by 2030 we can be above 90% of the average level of output, therefore also income of the European Union. And I think that the future for a country like Poland is not to be too ambitious. Definitely we have to be ambitious. Everybody is supposed to be ambitious, but not to aim too far and then to miss the target, but to find our place within the European continent. A core of each is European Union, but also to play our part in the global economy. And for that perspective, we have to look towards West. This is Germany, France, or Brussels, but we have to look also towards East, starting from China. So if you would ask me about the question how I see next 10 or 20 years, I think that our economic relations, our cooperation with China will be expanding faster than, for instance, our cooperation with Germany, because we can afford, we can accomplish much more with cooperation, what you call win-win cooperation, towards East than towards West.
Maybe it's not a precise way to characterize your pursuit of the dream becoming yet a major power. Perhaps you want to take advantage of the further economic integration with the European Union, looking west instead of east. Now, having said this, do you complain, or you share the complaints that Poland is too far away from God, but too close to Russia?
No, I think that the smart strategy, again, long shot, I'm not talking about 2-3 years. I'm rather trying to apply a vision of 2-3 generations. We have to take advantage of our geopolitical position. Most of the history, you're right, to be between Russia and Germany, it was a curse. It was nothing which was helping our performance, our development, our culture, sometimes even language and so on. But now, at the time of irreversible, one more time, globalization, at the time of technological revolution, of this transformation of globalization, as you would like to call it in China, we have to escape forward. And the escape forward means that we have to create the best possible cultural, political, economic relations, both with the West, of which we become a part due to this gradual transformation and due to my strategy, which is known as new pragmatism. It is neither neoliberalism or new nationalism. This is new pragmatism. And the best possible relations with the East, not only with Russia, but also with Ukraine and Belarus, which are not the members of the European Union, farther away, Turkey, and then Central Asia, and then India, and first of all, China, and so on. So we, during this time of globalization of the last 30 years or so, we become a core European country. But we didn't globalize that much as we should and we could. And I think that if I'm looking for another 25 years, I think we will become even more engaged in globalization, still being the crucial member of the European Union and the leading economy of East Central Europe. But it must be based on new pragmatism, which is a kind of social market economy which is aiming for triple balance, not only the economic one, input, output, export, import, revenue, expenditure, savings, investment, but also on one hand social equilibrium, social cohesion, and on the other way, ecological one. So I see the aspects of this new pragmatism, as I call it, also here in China, and that makes me rather satisfied as an economist.
Small in size, Poland is a big name for many well-educated Chinese for at least one reason: the piano player and musician Chopin.
This is our greatest achievement in the history. I'm proud of Polish culture a lot. I'm proud of the history of my country, but I can also be proud of our economy. We could do better. We are not doing that good as China, but we are really the leader, a champion, as somebody says, of this post-socialist transition to market and liberal democracy in East Central Europe. Nobody has done as good as we, but that doesn't mean that we are perfect. Even you in China, you are short of being perfect. So we have to learn from each other. That is why I'm coming as often as possible to China, and I invite everybody to visit Poland.
Thank you very much for your polite comments on the success of the Chinese economy. We got a strong feeling, however successful the Polish economy and the Polish country might be, they are always enveloped in the atmosphere of a victimhood, given the history, which is pretty unique, particularly in the Second World War, and especially the tone of Chopin's music. I'll see you next time.